Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the MIT Sloan Latin America and MIT Sloan Global Programs webinar tonight with Professor Stuart Madnick on cybersecurity. For those of you coming to us from around the world, we hope that you're all safe and well, and we're very happy to be sharing this presentation. Stuart Madnick is the John Norris Maguire Professor of Information Technologies Emeritus at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he's the founding director of cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. He currently heads the cybersecurity initiative, and he holds his PhD in computer science from MIT. Professor Madnick has been a faculty member at MIT since 1972. The reason that we're bringing this webinar to you today is that we felt that cybersecurity, no matter what time, no matter what crisis, is important for you to all to know. And as many of us are moving entirely online and dealing with more issues and Zoom bombing and all of these different aspects, we thought it would be the perfect setting for Professor Madnick to speak to you all and give you a little bit of what every manager should know about cybersecurity. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Madnick.
Hello, I want to welcome you all a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening, depending upon where in the world you are, and I hope you're keeping safe. As you mentioned, I realize I appreciate you joining us in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. In many ways, I plan to talk about a somewhat related virus, that is the potential of a computer virus pandemic. So there is, I guess, a connection between the two. And as the title states, I'm going to talk about what every manager should know about cybersecurity. So I don't know the background of all of you participating. I assume some of you may be quite expert in issues regarding cybersecurity, but even for those, hopefully some of the things we'll talk about will be things that might be useful to you in explaining it to the rest of your organization. And for those of you who've not been deeply involved in it, hopefully this will present some new perceptions. Also, I wanted to introduce you to MIT behind me right here. The talk I'm going to give is actually based, let's see, it's going to talk on, hold on a second while it's based upon a talk I gave in Brazil almost a year ago. And the issue there was once again looking at cybersecurity, but intended for non-technical people. We had members of the board of governors of the Brazilian bank and so on. So hopefully this will be useful to a wide variety of people and audience. And I will try to encourage you to ask questions as I go, or if it's not possible or we run out of time, do feel free to contact me afterward. Now, normally when I give this talk to a live audience, I do encourage direct audience participation. And normally I started by asking this question. That is, do you know if your organization has experienced a cyber attack? And in a typical audience, a certain number of hands will go up, sometimes a few and sometimes a vast majority. But I asked that question in a very specific way. I'm asking, do you know if your organization has experienced a cyber attack? The reason why I do that, in our research, we have found that a typical cyber attack, particularly in America and Europe, often runs for over 120 days before it's discovered. And in the Pacific Asia area, the number can be much longer than that. So the fact that you don't know if your organization has experienced cyber attack does not mean it isn't currently experienced cyber attack, just not known yet. Now, what I want to do in this presentation, since cyber attacks and cyber issues are getting increasing amount of attention, more and more things you will hear about, read about, or talk about with your colleagues. Unfortunately, a lot of things that we hear are not necessarily correct or accurate. I call them often myths. Some of you may have heard them, some may not, but I'll go through what I consider to be some of the major myths I've heard and try to relate them to what the actual facts are. So let me go through that agenda. So the first one, of course, is obviously many of you are in management positions or executive positions and possibly not connected with, say, the IT department or technology in your company. So the question is, why would cybersecurity be important to executives? Well, there are many reasons, but I'll just share with you a few. I don't know how many of you remember, almost about 2 years ago, Equifax was hit with a cyber attack. And almost immediately thereafter, the chief information officer and chief security officer were out. Well, that's kind of sad for their careers. And of course, there was a rising call for the firing of the CEO. It turns out he chose to retire soon thereafter. So cyber attacks can have a consequence throughout your organizations and often impacts on your career. Now, the next thing, and once again, I realize many of you have many different experiences, but when I talk to, I call the average person in the street about cybersecurity, what often comes to mind is the idea or the issue of stolen credit cards. Now, I realize the situation is different in different parts of the world, but in the United States, typically, if your credit card number is stolen and misused, usually you are only responsible for about the first $50 of charges. And in fact, I'm not sure I'm aware of anybody who's ever been charged that actual $50. Obviously, getting new credit cards issued and things like that can be a hassle, but if that's the only impact of a cyber attack is a bit of inconvenience and possibly a $50 fine, it doesn't sound like a very big deal. So I want to give a kind of a broader view. And once again, in the limited amount of time we have today, I'll only hit a few highlights, but I want to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem we're dealing with. Now, once again, in a live session, I would ask if anybody happens to recall, and hopefully some of you may have heard about the WannaCry attack that happened on Friday, May 12th, 2017. As it turned out, that particular day, one of my students came into my office, a student who came from Spain, and and this involves a ransomware. So just to explain what ransomware is a cyber attack that basically locks up your computer. Not just locks it up so it doesn't work, but locks it up so that all the data that was on your computer is scrambled. And so even if you can, quote, unlock your computer to get it to work again, it's useless to you because none of the data and information you have is available. And that's what happened with the WannaCry attack. So a student came into my office. He had previously worked at Telefonica, a major telephony company in Spain, and he showed me a copy of this screenshot that had been sent to him. And I assume many of you have much better Latin than Spanish than I do, but the key thing was urgent, turn off your laptop immediately. It turned out that particular cyber attack locked up 80% of all of Telefonica's computers. So what did they do? You can't do much, just sent all the employees home. So that's an example of a kind of thing that can be quite disruptive to your company if basically your company is shut down. In fact, in that particular attack, 300,000 computers around the world in over 100 countries were attacked within hours. So in many ways, that is not exactly a major pandemic, but it's a kind of mini pandemic. So these are the kinds of viruses that we talk about that can spread around the world very rapidly and have a major effect. Now, there was another phenomenon called Notpetya. It had a similar appearance to it, and it asked people to pay money, but it turns out it really didn't want money. It just wanted to keep you busy trying to collect the money to pay it. It really was, I call it, just plain evil. It was an attempt just to disrupt as many businesses as possible. And hundreds of computers were hit. Federal Express, TNT, Maersk, many other companies. Now, one thing I want to pause for a second, and I apologize because this would be a time I would encourage people to ask questions. You're welcome to put in some Q&A, and either Lee or Jacqueline will forward them to me if any particular ones we want to address. But I want to talk about something that most people are not too familiar with. And that's what I call supply chain and third-party risks. In many of these cyber attacks, you may not even be the target. I think in the military, they call this, you may be collateral damage. So let me just talk a little bit about the Notpetya attack as an example. Now, it's not clear who was behind the Notpetya attack. There is some suspicion that it may have originated from Russia, but let's leave that to the side. One of the things I want to explain as I go through my talk, almost nothing about cyber attacks can be said with 100% accuracy. There's so many ways that people can disguise themselves, misdirect, that all I can do is talk about very likely, and very few cases can you say with certainty. But in any case, in this particular case, the cyber attack, we believe, was actually aimed at very specifically companies in the Ukraine. And in fact, it hit a number of companies in Ukraine, including the LATAM group, which is a company that provided accounting software, kind of like, Quicken Books and so on, to many companies in the Ukraine. So that was the target of the attack. But like much of the software that you get, there are periodic updates. For example, in the case of accounting software, tax laws change, accounting rules change, and so on. So there has to be an ability for the source of that software to provide updates to you. And in fact, the Notpetya virus piggybacked on the updating software from LATAM and provided spread the virus wheel to all of its customers, including the Maersk operation in the Ukraine. When it got onto the Maersk computer in the Ukraine, that was also connected to the Maersk global network that then proceeded to spread the virus to Maersk in New Jersey, in England, and Japan. So this was a case where, as far as we could believe, Maersk was not necessarily intended to be the target. It was merely various Ukrainian companies, but through their interconnections with other companies like Maersk and others, it was spread throughout their networks. There's an interesting side story about Maersk. I'll be very brief about it. It turns out that many companies have backups of their data, but there's a very key database that Maersk has that is constantly being updated. But since it is replicated across, I've got the number, but it's like 64 different Maersk sites, there was felt to be no need to back it up. First, because it's changing all the time. And secondly, if one site went down, there are still 63 other copies you can get it from. In this case, every one of those databases on every one of the sites was locked up, except for one. One of the Maersk sites, I believe it was in Ghana, but I may have the country wrong, had communication problems that day and was not currently connected to the Maersk global network. And only because of that, they were able to retrieve a recent copy of that database and arrange to have it transmitted to all the other sites to recover from it. I can go into a much longer story, but I'm just trying to illustrate the magnitude of the impact that a cyber attack can have on the operation of almost any company. Let me go on again. We're not just talking about stealing credit card numbers and money. Let's talk about another case. I assume many of you have heard of SWIFT. SWIFT, as you may know, is a worldwide funds transfer or funds communication network. I won't go into the nuances of exactly how SWIFT prefers to define itself. But in fact, there was a cyber attack, not directly to SWIFT itself. Remember I talked about third parties, but attacked one of the companies, or in this case, a bank that was using SWIFT. And through that attack on that bank, it managed to steal $81 million. Sounds like a lot. It turns out they actually were attempting to steal approximately $1 billion. But apparently, due to a typographical error, a lot of their messages were rejected. If they had just spent a few dollars on a spell checker, they might have been $1 billion richer. So there can be massive amounts of money that can be disrupted or stolen. But it's not just about money. Those of us in the United States are very familiar with all kinds of concerns about impacts to things like election systems and general citizen information or misinformation. So there can be all kinds of impacts across your organization and across your society. But finally, it can be more than money and more than impacts. It could impact your property and your life. For example, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the attack on the Turkish pipeline explosion or in the German steel mill. Many of you may have heard about the cyber attack on the Ukrainian power grid. And of course, there's constant reports about at least penetrations into the United States electric grid. Let me just check and see. I got some Q&As here. Anything? Okay, there's a question regarding phishing, which I'll come up with a little bit later on. And there's a question about the issue of the value chains and the supply chain. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Put that off to the side. I'm gonna get this to. There we go. Okay, so let me take a quick comment regarding what I call physical damage. That is attacks on industrial control systems like power systems or pipelines or steel mills and so on. Most of you probably, if you've had any experience in your company or read about cyber attacks, they're typically attacks to IT systems. Your computer is locked up or data is stolen from it, which can have all kinds of problems. But in general, no one is physically harmed in the process. But a cyber attack on what I call a cyber physical system or an industrial control system can cause real physical damage. And of course, it's often difficult to recover because it's often hard to convert back to manual control. I won't go into details of this, but one of the byproducts of automation is a lot of the mechanical safety features of these devices are now being increasingly put into the software. So if the cyber attack can take control of the software, it can also take control of the safety features. Now, I don't know how many of you, I know many of you may be MIT alumni, and MIT is famous for being an engineering school. And unfortunately, one of the big things that you learn in engineering actually can be a disadvantage to you. What I mean by that, most of you have learned about independent failure. If I have, for example, 8 generators in my power plant, we know they're mechanical devices. And we know that sooner or later they'll fail. So one might fail, but it's unlikely that any of the others will fail at the exact same time. That's called independence of failure. But if it's a cyber attack, the cyber attack that knocks out one generator can just as easily knock out the second, third, fourth, and all the rest generators at the same time. When I talk to people in industrial control systems, this is something most of them have not heard in school, particularly 10 or 20 years ago, because that was highly unlikely to happen with a physical failure. And of course, recovering from physical damage can take a long time. There's an interesting book. I don't get any commission from it, but I just like the headline here. This is from a Ted Koppel book called Lights Out. And he said here that a devastating cyber attack on America's power grid is not only possible, but likely. And the United States is shockingly unprepared. I just want to note this and then once again, there's a lot more we can cover, and I encourage many of you to contact me afterward. But if you think about this, you say, well, wait a minute, that's pretty serious, but I'm not in the electric energy business, so it's not particularly interesting to me. But how well does your business run without electricity? Oh, maybe your company happens to have backup generators. Well, how long will they run for? And more importantly, do your customers and suppliers? So in some sense, although this is not a direct attack on you, knocking out your power grid will have a major impact upon you. Let me just take a quick look and see questions. Okay, there's a question regarding cryptocurrencies. I will get to that as well. Thank you. Always, I often joke to the audience, I should pay you guys for asking the right questions. Not exactly at the right time, but asking the right questions. So let me talk about another issue. I've talked to you about all phases of this problem, and it's not a surprise to many of you. At least some of these things are not a surprise to you. And obviously you and the government and the industry are working very hard to deal with these problems. So an obvious question is, well, how are we doing in solving this problem? So let me give you the good news. The good news, as shown by this curve, is the good guys are getting better at dealing with cyber attacks. That's the good news. Unfortunately, I often say the bad guys are getting badder faster, and this gap is growing. As the headline below shows from Washington Post, the hackers are getting better at offense, and the companies aren't getting better enough at defense. And why and how does that happen? Well, many of you may assume, often you see these cartoons of this hacker with a hoodie on in the basement someplace, who may have a PhD or studied computers for many years. It turns out it ain't that hard. You don't have to be a super techie to do a cyber attack. You can buy almost everything you need. For example, you can buy what's called on the dark web, all kinds of cyber tools for cyber attack, including tools developed, say, by the US government at cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Many of these tools were actually bought from the dark web and then used in the WannaCry and Notpetya attack. We have an interesting paper I can refer you to that appeared in the Sloan Management Review that talks about the whole global cybercrime ecosystem. I jokingly say it makes drug cartels look like child's play. So there's all kinds of ways to put together a cyber attack. And as I mentioned here, a lot of time the hacking tools they use are hacking tools that actually were stolen. Now I'm going to do two brief side trips, if you will. These are things that people often ask about. There's a new phenomenon going on, I'll say recently. Obviously, many of these things have been in the works for several years. One of them has to do with called the Internet of Things. I'll be very brief about it, but the idea of Internet of Things is that computers are in almost everything. Even toothbrushes. What you see here is a photograph of a toothbrush my wife bought. And if you see that red oval there, that shows you that you're connected to the Bluetooth and connected to the internet. Well, why would you want your toothbrush connected to the internet? Well, it turns out it monitors your brushing habit, if you will. It will send a report to your smartphone telling you that you're brushing correctly or not correctly. If you happen to be an adult and the toothbrush is being used by your child, it will let the adult know that the child is or isn't brushing correctly. And it also can be allowed to send a message to your dentist. So the next time you visit your dentist can update you on what you should or shouldn't be doing with your toothbrush. I often jokingly say that almost every product will have a computer in it before long. Except, I often jokingly say, except bricks. And then someone brought me an article about smart bricks. So maybe every item in the world will soon have a computer in it. What that means, there are many more attack services and novel ways for you to be attacked. I'll just give you two brief examples. There was an attack on an LG smart refrigerator. This was one of those refrigerators that had a camera built into it, so that while you were at the supermarket, you could look inside your refrigerator and say, oh, I'm short of eggs. Oh, it looks like I have plenty of milk. A cyber attack got into the computer on that refrigerator, and while pumping out ice cubes, was also sending out pornographic spam. Imagine the police breaking down your door and arresting your refrigerator. Now, these are things that could happen. One other example, I don't know how often you've come across this. I was recently at the New York Hilton in New York City, actually before the virus hit it, but not too long ago. And they're one of the hotels that have these smart locks where you could use your smartphone to get into your hotel room. Well, there was an Austrian hotel that also had installed such a smart lock system, but it suffered a cyber attack. The cyber attacker took control of its computers and reset all the locks in the hotel. Now, the good news is you could get out of your room. You just could not get back into your room again. So this is just an example. So the message to all of you as managers in your company, number one, you need to be careful about what products you buy and to understand what cyber risks they may be exposing you to. This is usually not the reason why you're buying. You're buying because there's some neat feature, but you haven't thought about how that neat feature could be turned about against you. And likewise, if you're making such products, you need to be careful to realize what danger you may be imposing upon your customers. Now, someone asked about cyber currencies and so on, which, as you may know, cyber currencies like Bitcoin are often based upon using what's called a blockchain system. And blockchain systems are not being used not only for cryptocurrencies, they're being used for all kinds of things, particularly for tracking supply chains. So supply chains of things like diamonds, supply chains of real estate, of rare artwork. So there's hundreds and thousands of applications that people are looking at regarding blockchains. I won't go into a brief introduction of what blockchains are. I'll assume either you know or you can look that up on your own. But what I did want to talk about is this question that was kind of posed earlier. Have blockchain systems ever been breached? And this is something which I find many people are a bit surprised about. In our research, and it was only looking at publicly reported reports, we found 72 breaches of blockchain systems. And in our tabulation, about $2 billion were stolen. And what's really intriguing about it, and we have a much longer report also in the Sloan Management Review, that many of the features that make blockchain so wonderful are also features that also make it most vulnerable or have side effects. I'll just give you two examples. We have many others. One of the things that's key to Bitcoin and blockchain is the idea there is no central control. You've got all of these servers or miners, if real, who validate things. The whole idea is there is no central control. Therefore, you have to worry about the system stopping. If any one server stops, there's thousands of other servers that keep going. But think of it. That means there's no way to stop the system, even if a cyber attack was discovered. As many of you may have heard in the past, the New York Stock Exchange has what they call circuit breakers. If certain things go, they just stop the stock exchange. There's no way to stop a blockchain. In fact, there was such an attack. People realized that money was being siphoned off. It was happened to be on the Ethereum blockchain, which is similar to Bitcoin. And they realized money was being siphoned off. They couldn't stop it. What they did do is they formed a band of good guys who used the same technique as the bad guy to steal the money faster and then return it to the rightful people afterward. So that's an example of one of the great features of blockchain actually turned out to be a liability. The other one, once again, is the notion of anonymity, in that you have these encrypted keys and nobody can get into your blockchain or account without that key. Of course, if that key gets lost, for example, if you have a safety deposit vault or a box at a bank, usually the bank either has a master key or can call a locksmith to get into your box if you lose your key. Ain't possible with a blockchain. And so, in fact, as this headline reports, a cyber currency CEO dies, leaving $137 million in his unopenable blockchain account. Once again, there's much, much more to this. We have a very detailed report describing these, and I've only touched upon cryptocurrencies, but hopefully it gives you the flavor. Let me move on. This is probably the most important part. I've kind of alluded to it at the very beginning. I don't have a good way how to go show of hands, as I often would do, to indicate how many of you are different parts of your business, from top executives to finance to marketing to IT. But there's an inclination many people have that cyber attacks is a technical thing, and it's best left to the technical people in the IT department to solve it. And let me tell you why that doesn't work. Although there's a lot of work being done in industry and research to improve the hardware and software to prevent cyber attacks, the majority of events, different estimates, depends how you count, between 70 and 80, I've heard numbers as high as 90% of cyber attacks are aided or abetted by insiders, usually unintentionally. That is, all of you and your colleagues are often the major way in which a cyber attack takes place. That's why we say it's important to address the managerial, organizational, and strategic aspects of cyber security. And okay, so as we say, it's not just about the technology, it's about human behavior. And one of the things we stress is managers, and this means all of you, can play an important role in building a culture of vigilance and awareness, or we call it cyber safety in your company. We have a number of research reports on this. One of the ones I note here appeared in the Wall Street Journal about how companies can create a cyber safe culture at work. And I encourage many of you to look at this and see how many of these things you are currently doing and which other ones might be useful to do. Let me take a quick look and see what other questions.
Stu, I'll read you the questions
okay.
after, and we can go over them.
Okay, I just looked at a few of them, and once again, I will be addressing many of the ones that there. So good news is we are thinking alike. A lot of the questions are questions that I plan to get to. So somebody asked about phishing earlier, so let me get to this issue in a minute. Phishing will come up a lot, and sort of mentioned briefly. So let's talk about this. There was a report from the Gardner Group with, I think, a fascinating headline that said, "Prevention is futile." Now, I don't know how many of you are fans of Star Trek, the television series, but there are the famous Borg, one of the enemies, who keep saying that resistance is futile. So I think in many ways, I think they've kind of captured the Borg instinct, and this applies. So what is phishing? Well, I assume all of you are familiar with it, but just to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, it's typically something like this. This is a typical one you might have seen, maybe not too recently, but several years ago. It typically would go like this. It would say, "Hello, I am a Nigerian prince. I just inherited a lot of money. And I was searching on the internet and I came across you. And you seem like a really nice person. So I would like to give you some of my money. All you have to do is pay the service fee or the taxes on it." Now, I don't know, and I want to ask for a show of hands of how many of you may have fallen for it. But strangely enough, we found that this is what's called a mass phishing. The typical success rate is between 1% and 3%. Now, I was surprised. I was actually told by someone that a lot of times these phishing emails actually are quite terrible deliberately. They're basically a form of IQ test. If you fall for that email, they know they've got a real sucker on the line, and it's worth their while to reel them in. So some of them are actually terribly done deliberately to see how gullible or greedy the person may be. With a kind of well-crafted but generic email, they tend to have up to a 10%. And I was asked to do an interview tomorrow about the coronavirus. There's an old saying, I don't know who first came up with it, but that is, never miss the opportunities created by a crisis. And so what's now happening, well, I'll give you some example here. This would be a typical one, notice from the IT help desk. We have heard rumors of a cyber attack on our campus or our company. You need to do the following things to protect our company and yourself. Well, the latest ones are, we believe there may be a coronavirus in your neighborhood. Click on the following link below to find out whether you may be close to a coronavirus victim or something. So they'll find something that is very emotionally charged. So these are generic. They're not aimed specifically at you, but they do try to do, they're typically well crafted, and they try to be things that and in fact, I would say at least once a month, I get one that I'm just this close to pushing the button on before I stop myself. So some of them are quite clever. And if they're smart enough to be somewhat personalized, that is, use your first and last name. Hello, Stuart, this is the IT department, that even has a higher hit rate of 18%. But what I really want to focus in on is spear phishing. I don't know how many of you know what spear phishing is or have heard that expression. And also, how successful is spear phishing? So first, what is spear phishing? Spear phishing is very targeted email. And it's one of the biggest cybersecurity threats facing organizations today because it works. In various studies, it has had a success rate up to 70%. It's interesting, I was reading an article a few months back about a reporter who was actually writing stories about cyber attacks. And he contacted what I will call a white hat, or at least a gray hat organization that basically helps to educate companies about cyber attacks. And as part of their process, they do tests to test out the safeness of the company. And what they said is, okay, we will this week cyber attack you. Be prepared. Okay. And they did various things, but it turns out before the week was out, he fell for one of them because they did their research. They went to his Facebook account. They basically knew more about him than maybe he did. And they developed, I won't go for the details of it, but basically it turns out he was a volunteer in an outdoors club and took photography with them. And he got an email from the head of the club saying, we have an event coming up this weekend. Our normal photographer is not available. Would you be willing to come in his place? And of course he said yes. That was all phony. So the point being is, if you're willing to take the time and effort to create a well-crafted spear phishing exercise, the odds are, at least in that case, they succeeded, even though he had been given a warning. And most of you were not given a warning ahead of time. The most typical types of spear phishing, I can't remember, there's a name for this, I can't remember what it's called. It's something like business email, something or other. But basically the typical form goes as follows. It's an email sent from the CEO of the company to the CFO of the company that reads something like this. Hello, Fred. We're engaged in a negotiation with a company in Korea. We're planning on buying one of their subsidiaries. And your company basically does, acquisitions on and off throughout the year. So this is not a shocking news. And we've retained a law firm to help us in this negotiation. And we need to send them a $100,000 retainer as part of our agreement. Now, this deal is moving very fast. So please make sure you arrange to get this transfer done within the next, say, 12 hours. Oh, and by the way, Fred, I'm going to be attending a webinar held by Stuart Madnick of MIT the rest of today, and I won't be available for a call. Well, let's say you're even a little bit suspicious. You call the CEO's office. You say, can I talk to the CEO? I'm sorry, Fred. The CEO is in a webinar with Stuart Madnick today, and he said he could not be disturbed. What do you do? Now, in this talk here, many people say, oh, I wouldn't do it. I'm not sure in the real life. If this was a deal that likely could have benefited the company to tens of millions of dollars, and you waited too long to get the law firm engaged and that deal fell through, I don't know. And if it was a real email from the CEO, would you be willing to take the chance of losing millions of dollars for your company? Just out of curiosity, this is just an example. I won't play time on it, but these are the examples. This was one that was held as part of a legal proceeding. So one of the biggest problems we find, by the way, I should explain what I said at the beginning, a lot of time companies that are hit with a cyber attack prefer not to say much about it. They prefer to keep it secret. First, it's kind of embarrassing. It may expose them to certain legal risks for possible, mismanagement or incompetence. And furthermore, it could encourage copycats to attack you too. Now that everybody knows you're not that secure. So there's all kinds of reasons why it's hard to get this information. Only usually when these things get to court, most things are settled out of court or I guess kept quiet altogether. Let me move on. Now, I hope I've gotten some of you concerned by now. And one of the questions that usually comes up probably about this time is, well, what can we do? What are some best practices? Well, let me share with you my personal view. There are no best practices. Remember I said earlier, the good guys are getting better, but the bad guys are getting badder even faster. There are poor practices and less poor practices. And this is just not my view. There was a conference where people recommended not calling them best practices, just call them current practices and practice sharing. I often say if the NSA, the Pentagon, the Israeli Defense Forces can be broken into, why do you want to think you're so much smarter? But there are things you can do. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. When this first came out about more than 5 years ago, it was called the White House Cybersecurity Framework, and some of our colleagues at MIT were involved in the formulation of it. It was then assigned to the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So it's now often referred to as the NIST framework. And so if you haven't looked into it, you should look into it. It's a good set of practices that will help your organization. But there are 5 key areas. So let me briefly go through what those 5 areas are. This is water, not vodka. After my talk, you may want the vodka. So the first one is what I call identify. What they call identify. I actually don't care for that term. I call it developing an organizational understanding of your cybersecurity risk. That is, if you don't understand that you're at risk, you're not going to do anything, and the next 4 boxes are irrelevant. And so much of what I've tried to do so far in this talk is really helped you to gain a broader view, hopefully, of what are the range of risks that your organization may have to deal with. The next one is what I call protect. And this is what many organizations, I suspect most of your organizations are probably doing some of, and that is to take various safeguards, getting firewalls, getting virus filters, all kinds of technologies you can incorporate into your organization to help protect it. The problem I have is many organizations stop there. I call it kind of the all or nothing. You put up a defense barrier around your organization, and if someone somehow gets past that barrier, everything is lost. It's very important, as I mentioned, to provide ways to do the detection. Remember I said before, often a cyber attack has been going on for 120 days or longer. We have several examples of 2 or 3 years the cyber attack was going on before anybody realized it. The analogy I use is imagine you ran a bank, and at closing time of the bank, one of the tellers leaves the bank with a wheelbarrow full of money. You think sooner or later someone would notice it, but that happens all the time with cyber attacks. The next one is called respond. When you do discover a cyber attack, what do you do? Now, I don't know whether you've been following the press, but often the CEO or the top executives, or in some cases the board, are caught by surprise. They get a call or a knock on a door from a newspaper reporter, or more typically nowadays, a television reporter saying, okay, what happened and what are you doing about it? Usually the first things you say are wrong and retract it, and that is not very good. So you need to have plans. The analogy I use, almost every company I imagine runs periodic fire drills. You know, what do you do if a fire breaks out in your company? How many of you have run fire drills for your cyber attack? It is a surprisingly small number we have come across so far, although it is increasing, and we're working with companies to institute that as part of their cyber culture. And then finally, recover. You know, how do you modify and improve your organization to make it more resilient and more capable of responding to and preventing cyber attacks? So one of the things I often ask for a show of hands, and once again, I'll assume you'll do it in your privacy, is ask you how many of you are using NIST in your organizations. Those of you are, that's good news, and hopefully you will continue to do so and do it diligently. I should stress, NIST is not the end all, it is a starting point. And for many organizations, it's a very valuable starting point. For those of you who aren't using NIST or something like it, doesn't have to be exactly NIST, we encourage you to do so. Okay. Let me pause for a second. I don't know, Lee, anything you want me to respond to or not yet?
I think one of the things that came up in those was how do people deal with viruses sleeping that you said a year or two? Ransomware that's already in their infrastructure is something that a couple of people have asked in different formats.
Okay, let me answer that in two kinds of ways, because one of the questions I saw was how do you deal with the ransomware, respond to ransomware? I'll give you two answers. Obviously, what ransomware does, of course, it scrambles up all your data. If you have current backups of your data, then you're more able to recover quickly. I won't go into it because it was a fascinating story. We had agents from the FBI come and give a talk to our group about a cyber attack. I don't know if you knew this, Lee and Jacqueline, to the Boston Children's Hospital. I hadn't realized it. That's a kind of nasty thing to do. Long story behind it. But the trouble was, for about a week, they had to run the hospital not knowing what medications to give to the children. They had to go back to paper records and chalkboards and so on. So it is bad news because they had not kept up-to-date backups of all of the data they had. So that's the first thing. The second thing may sound a bit odd, and that is pay the ransomware. Official US policy is you don't pay the ransomware. One of the first cyber attacks I came across, this is probably well over 6 or 7 years ago, was an attack on the Renham Police Department in Renham, Massachusetts, a small town. And the FBI agents came, and this is off the record, and the agent asked him, well, did you have data that is important, criminal investigations going on and things like that, that you don't have good paper backups of? And do you have backups? And the answer was, yes, there was useful information, and yes, we don't have backups. Then he whispered, you might want to pay. So this is not official policy. The example I give, and this is a long story also, many of you may have heard the city of Baltimore, Maryland, was hit with a cyber attack, I guess about 8 or 9 months ago. I forgot exactly how recent it was. Some parts of the city didn't recover for 3 or 4 months. Other parts recovered in a few weeks. So for example, if you went in to renew your driver's license, you couldn't do that. If you went in to get a building permit to repair your, add something onto your house, you couldn't do that. So all kinds of things were gobbled up. The ransomware was looking for $60,000. They said, our policy is we don't pay ransom. Last I heard, the number was $16 million they've been spent so far, not counting the disruption of part of the city being out of operation for anywhere from weeks to months. But okay, so it's a long story. I hope that's enough to give you kind of the flavor of some of the things you can do regarding ransom and ransomware and cyber attacks. If any others come up, let me know, Lee. I'm going to continue on, if you don't mind. So I'm going to ask now is, what is MIT doing about all of this? Oops, let me go back a slide here. So about, it's now getting on to be 6 years ago. I've been involved in cybersecurity on and off for many years. In fact, it was only by coincidence at another alumni meeting that I happened to find out, or remember, if you will, that actually I had co-authored a book called Computer Security in 1979. Many of my students didn't even know computers existed that far back. So I've been involved in cybersecurity on and off. But about 6 years ago, we formed a group at the Sloan School called the Interdisciplinary Consortium for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. Now that is a mouthful, but as you can see, the initials are IC, or we call it IC cubed, so that we went by that for about 2 years or so. But people really stumbled at trying to remember that. And so a couple of years ago, we changed it to Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. So that's the name we operate under. The idea behind it, I've kind of already given you the prelude to this, and that is, although a lot of attacks on conventional systems are important, we felt it's very important to also address cyber physical systems, things like energy systems, power systems, autonomous vehicles, etc., because they receive much less research. So that's one of our focal areas. But the other important focal area is, as I said earlier, improving the hardware and software is helpful. The analogy I often like to use is, imagine you get a much better lock to put on your door. But if you still keep putting the key under the mat, are you really any more secure? And so that's why we say it's very important to address, we call them managerial, organizational, and strategic aspects of cybersecurity. So we have a research group based at MIT. We have about 25 corporate partners from all over the world, many from the US, but we've got things like HSBC in England. We've got NG of Belgium. In Latin America, we have C6 Bank in Brazil. We have Hitachi in Japan. So it is an international collaboration of researchers at MIT and corporations around the world. And we have something in a range of around 25 different projects going on. I probably could spend half an hour on each of these projects, in which case you would miss your dinner, lunch, breakfast, or whatever it is the next meal you would have had coming up is. So I won't go through all of them, but I do encourage you to contact our website and get an idea of what we're working on, and there may be some projects that may be of interest to you. But to give you a flavor of what I mean by addressing the managerial organizational aspects, I'm going to look at one of our particular projects, the one I circled here, to be called Cybersafety. The logic behind it goes as follows. Many organizations, particularly industrial organizations, but many organizations have been doing things to prevent accidents in their companies for many years. And the question was, can we learn anything from the types of things that were being done to prevent accidents in companies that we could apply to our research to identify what we like to call the cyber hazards? Let me give you a simple example. I mentioned NASA here. Many of you may recall the NASA's Space Shuttle Challenger explosion about a decade or so ago, I believe. If you read the industry reports on it, it will tell you that the space shuttle had these O-rings, and I'm not a space shuttle expert, but O-rings are like a rubbery material that kind of seals things in. And the O-rings, if they get particularly cold, become brittle. If they become brittle, they can fracture, creating a leak. It turns out that NASA Space Shuttle Challenger was launched on a particularly chilly Florida day. And it turned out one of the O-rings got brittle, fractured, released gas, which exploded, and unfortunately killed the astronauts. And that's what you would read in the newspapers. But it turns out some of my colleagues at MIT were part of a study commission formed to investigate the accident. And of course, they recognized all those things I just said, but they went deeper. And in their report, they came to the conclusion that an accident, not that particular accident necessarily, but an accident of some kind like that, was inevitable due to organizational changes that had taken place at NASA over the previous 3 years. In particular, the safety division that had previously been autonomous became part of the operations division that had contractual obligation for a certain number of launches within certain time windows. And although not deliberate, over that 3-year period, the risk tolerances and practices slowly changed to the point the study committee concluded that there was a 1 chance in 50 of a cyber attack taking, of an accident taking place. And this was launch number 81. They were doing better than expected. The reason I say that, you see how organizational behavior, organizational changes can affect, in this case here, the occurrence of an accident. So we took that kind of logic. There's a research done by my colleague at MIT in the aeronautics department called STAMP, which is a methodology for understanding and preventing accidents, we've adopted it. We call it Cybersafety, and we've used it to analyze various cyber attacks and also been able to uncover vulnerabilities not previously discovered. I'm going to briefly give you a little flavor of it, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we do. As I mentioned, we've got 25 projects that are doing vastly different things, but this will at least give you a flavor of it. The first thing is this cyber safety approach is top down. It starts out by asking you what it is that's important to your organization, sometimes called what are the crown jewels. The simple example I use, let's say at MIT that there are 10,000 doors at MIT. I've never counted. And it might be nice at night if all 10,000 doors were locked. But not all 10,000 doors are equally important. If you could identify which doors are most important and put extra emphasis on them, then the risk you're facing can be significantly reduced. It turns out understanding what are you trying to prevent, what are your crown jewels, is an exercise that a surprisingly large number of organizations have not done or have not done very thoroughly. So that's the first part of the exercise. The second thing is we assume that there's a process model. That is, we assume everything in your organization is a process, but for every process, there is some way in which you are controlling that process, some way in which you are monitoring the process and taking corrective action. What we think about or claim, both regarding accidents and most cyber attacks, we argue is a breakdown in control. Something that should have been or was intended to be controlled was not being adequately controlled. And it turns out the controller itself is a process, so therefore there is a controller monitoring the controller, et cetera, et cetera. It is a hierarchical process. These are the three key principles. It's top down. We understand that there are processes that must be controlled and that these controls are hierarchical. Now that's kind of vague, kind of general, but hopefully those of you with engineering training, this may kind of resonate with you, which is always a good thing to have. Let me give you one example. This is the TJX data breach. Now, it goes back well over 10 years from now. As it turns out, we've studied other ones as recent as last year and that have almost all the same properties to them. So I picked this one because, as I said earlier, getting detailed information about what actually happens in a cyber attack isn't easy. In this particular case, there was a big court action. Tens of thousands of emails and documents were disclosed in court actions that we were able to get action to. So it allowed us to do a much more detailed analysis than is often possible in other cases. In this particular case, 45 million credit card numbers were stolen. As I think I may have mentioned in the announcement of this talk, we have a study actually in conjunction with our colleagues at C6 Bank in Brazil, tabulating data breaches. We came up with the number that last year, that's 2018, there were 6 billion data records stolen. And in 2019, there were 13 billion data records stolen. By that measure, 45 million is a drop in a bucket. But once again, at the time, it was a big deal. Now, I said we have this hierarchical structure. So this is what the hierarchical structure might look like. I will not go through it in great detail. You can see the oval near the bottom is the retail bank. Oh, let me step back away. If you read the headlines about the TJ Maxx, by the way, TJX, for those who don't know it, is the parent company of TJ Maxx, Home Goods, Marshalls. These are discount retail stores, very widespread in the United States and Canada, I believe also in the UK. I don't believe they have any operations in Latin America or elsewhere in the world, but they're a fairly major corporation. According to the stories you'll read in the press, the break-in took place through what's called war driving. That is, someone was driving around with a car equipped to pick up Wi-Fi signals. And they drive into a shopping center parking lot and listen for Wi-Fi signals. And they picked up a Wi-Fi signal from a Marshalls store in a mall outside of Miami, Florida. And having picked up that Wi-Fi signal, they penetrated the Wi-Fi network within that store. From that Wi-Fi network in that store, they get to the corporate network, and then the rest is history. That's kind of the highlight that you'll get in the store. That's why I circled it right there. So that's the entry point, but there's much more to the story. Just like there was more than the O-rings involved in the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. And things, for example, going up one level here, you see the payment card processing system. For any of you who may work in the retail industry throughout the world, probably are familiar with what's called PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. At that time, it was relatively new, and it turned out that TJX, in fact, was not complying with the payment card processing system. You see over here on the right-hand side, Fifth Third Bancorp was a credit card processing company for TJX. And they knew that TJX was not abiding by the standard. And they could have just said, we will not process your credit cards. But they chose to take the transactions anyway. Why? I haven't asked them, but it's not likely you want to turn down one of your biggest customers. So that was one case where a control could have been introduced that would have forced or encouraged TJX to be PCI compliant, but they chose not to do so. As you go up this hierarchy, I will skip over all of them, except this one right here, the state legislature. What in the world does the state legislature have to do with a credit card theft of TJX originating through a Marshall store outside of Miami, Florida? Well, it turns out that if those who may be MIT alumni, you may have noticed this on the Mass Pike. TJX's headquarters is in Framingham, Massachusetts. Just off the turnpike, you can see its sign. If TJX had been based in Nevada in the United States, the Nevada state regulations required all retail stores to be PCI DSS compliant, in which case TJX would have been PCI compliant, and much of what caused this attack, I haven't gone through all the details of the attack, but much which allowed it to actually complete its attack could not have been done. TJX was based in Massachusetts, and at that time, Massachusetts had no such requirement that TJX abide by that standard. By the way, as a side issue, one of the projects we have going on right now has a lot to do with compliance, regulations, and their impact on cybersecurity, the good, bad, and the ugly. So anybody who's interested in that particular project would love to talk to you about it. Just look at some of the issues here. There are several things, I'm just looking at the hierarchical structure. So we do this at each level. We ask, what is it at that level should the control be doing? Well, the control should be checking to make sure the data is encrypted, to make sure the data is PCI compliant, to make sure you're only retaining data that you need, and of course that your systems are well tested. As I mentioned earlier, TJX was not compliant, it turns out. They also retain more customer data than needed and for longer periods. In other words, if you don't retain the data, there's no way someone can steal it. If you retain data that you really don't need, the only value it may have is to the criminal, not to you. It's kind of dumb. They did not fully test their system. That's why the cyber attack went on for over a year before it was uncovered. And once again, almost always the uncovery is discovered not by the company, but by somebody else. Either the police come and say, there seems to be an awful lot of phony credit cards coming for based on your company. Do you think something is going on? So a lot of time discovery takes place by somebody else, not by the company. So it could be even longer. They were sending a lot of data around that was unencrypted. And although Visa and also the Fifth Bancorp had told them that they really were not compliant, they didn't gain the compliance until another year. And one of the reasons why is the organization actually wasn't even aware they were not compliant. So let me explain this. One of the things that Professor Levson often talks about, I often like to stress it, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning. and I talked about the fact that the coronavirus has created fantastic opportunities. I just got another contact about people applying for unemployment money from the government for people who are dead. And the government's paid out several hundreds of millions of dollars already. So in any case, so whenever there's a change that takes place, whether it's a change you initiate, in this case here, TJX was one of the first companies to install Wi-Fi in its stores, or externally, a coronavirus affects all the organizations. Whenever that happens, that puts you into a higher risk situation because you're dealing with things you weren't prepared to deal with. And so there are three things. One, as I mentioned here, is putting Wi-Fi into their stores was a new phenomenon, and they were not very familiar with the risk. Remember, I talked to you before about the Internet of Things, whether it be computer-controlled refrigerators or computer-controlled toothbrushes. These are new things that most of us have not had 10, 20, 30 years of experience with, and that makes us very vulnerable. This was often called recall bias. If you have not had a cyber attack before, it is quite reasonable for you to assume that you will not have a cyber attack in the future. I realize that sounds ridiculous, but we've actually studied this, and this is a human bias. It's very common. A friend of mine told me an interesting story. 50% of all burglar alarm systems, home burglar alarm systems, are sold within 2 weeks after the house was broken into. So humans have this natural inclination to assume, yes, the company down the corner may have been broken into, but it won't happen to us. And finally, it was called, here I call the confirmation trap. By the way, something very similar to this also happened in the case of NASA. And that is as follows. This is a sample of one of the emails that was disclosed as part of the legal action that took place. This was an email from the CIO of TJX to his staff. Roughly speaking, it says, we realize that we are not PCI DSS compliant, and it's something we really should do. But as you all know, we're approaching the Christmas season, and we're going to be very busy. And of course, this has been a tough year, and our budget is kind of tight. Don't you all agree with me that it'd be okay if we postpone it till next year? This may shock you. None of his staff disagreed. And so in many ways, they kind of tricked themselves into a false sense of security, and they postponed the upgrade until after the cyber attack took place. And as I said, there were similar events took place we studied on the Challenger Space Shuttle decision to launch. So I'm almost ready to wrap up, and then I can come back and maybe answer some of the questions I didn't get around to answering. I want to make sure that I'm doing time-wise, not too far off. So the first thing I want to mention regarding this TJX one, what you see here, as I said, the reason why we're able to get so much information was it underwent an extensive study by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and its Canadian counterpart, because they had major stores in Canada as well. And these are all examples of things that came up in the reports by the FTC or the CPC that were not uncovered in their reports, but came out by us doing our cyber safety analysis. So the point being is it's very important. We can really uncover things that are going on inside the organization that are observable if you know where to look or know what to look for. But in most cases, people aren't looking at it. So let me wrap up. The good news is there are fantastic new technologies. I've talked about IoT. Several of you asked about cryptocurrencies or blockchain. They have all kinds of great benefits, but they also create many more attack surfaces. I didn't put on that list the issue of AI systems. We're looking into how AI systems both help you, but also produce whole sets of new risks. So as I often like to say, to kind of give you a chance to not sleep tonight, the worst is yet to come. Most companies are, I say, driving, looking through the rear view mirror. They're looking for what was the cyber attack that hit them or hit somebody else last year, not the likely cyber attack that has never been seen before that'll hit them next week or next month or next year. We're seeing new ones all the time. And of course, providing new technologies provide new attack surfaces for new cyber attacks. So it's very important to understand this evolving threat landscape. The main goal I have of this talk, of the various stages of the NIST model, was to focus on the first one, to really help you to understand what are the risks your organization may have that you may not be aware of yet. It's very important to understand that your wealth, the political stability, your property, and even your physical well-being is at stake. And if you don't understand these risks, you won't take any of the necessary actions to help reduce these risks. But as managers, you are the one who needs to take the lead. The technology folks can help you out. For example, the decision of whether to pay the ransom or not is not something you assign to the junior assistant programmer trainee. There are so many decisions that management needs to make, needs to think about, and needs to be prepared for. As I said, if you want more information, please feel free to contact me. I believe my email address is on the earlier slide. It's very simple, smadnick@mit.edu. And I'll be glad to answer any additional questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Stu, for the great talk and trying to help managers get a sense of what's going on. Just one or two questions that seem to be through the chat is, what are your thoughts about the security of the cloud? Is it more secure, less secure? How should people manage that in terms of moving their companies and their files to the cloud?
As I said, you have a great audience here. They're asking all the right questions. In fact, we just ran a conference about a month ago about the issue of cybersecurity in the cloud. I'll try to give you a brief answer because it's got many, many facets to it, but I'll give you my personal kind of highlight issue. The cloud has tremendous advantages, and for many organizations, the cloud providers, whether it be Amazon or Microsoft or Google, probably have a better or a larger team of experts than probably you could afford in your company. That's the good news. The bad news, and you may remember, what was it, Capital One. I don't know how many are familiar with it. Capital One was one of the relatively recent cyber attacks. I forgot, I think it was, I want to say 100 million credit cards were stolen, plus or minus 100 million. I don't know, it's that kind of number. It was due to a misconfigured cloud application. So the issue here is that the cloud is something new to companies, just like Wi-Fi was new to TJX 10 years ago. And your company's ability to fully understand how to utilize the cloud, how to use the right settings, and to be sure you're not leaving kind of keys under the mat or windows open is a big problem. And we have seen, I don't have a count of them, many attacks through the cloud. Not that Microsoft or Amazon didn't do their job well, is they gave you a lock, but you didn't turn the lock on, or you left the key under the mat, or you left the door locked, but you forgot to close the window. And so the mere fact you move to the cloud does not necessarily mean you are more secure unless you fully understand what you have done in moving to the cloud.
Stu, the other question that people are asking, what about these virtual assistants like Alexa or, you know, in Google, or all of these that you're just speaking to, or Siri? You're shaking your head, doesn't sound good.
Well, I have to be careful. I don't want my wife to hear me. She may panic, if you will. I had an interesting conversation with one of the attendees. We do run an in-person executive program at Sloan, and one of the executives there was someone from the U.S. government, and at that time we were talking about privacy. So this is kind of related to your point regarding privacy issues. And I asked a show of hands, how many people are worried about their privacy? And strange enough, she didn't raise her hand. I said, why didn't you raise your hand? And she said, well, you got to understand, I'm a member of the federal government. And I'm not sure how many of you remember this. This goes back, I'll say 5 years or so ago. There was a break-in to the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. These are the people who have all the detailed records. If any of you ever filled out a confidentiality or secret, top secret, you had to go and talk about who was your first grade teacher, where did you live, and did you ever do anything wrong in your life, and so on. All those records, including your fingerprints, were all stolen. As this person said, well, I know I have no privacy. So in some sense, hate to say it, that's almost the attitude you have to have. I'm not saying that Alexa or Siri or any of those are doing anything bad. I will give you an example. One of the studies we did, we have a study we call of the issue of what countries are doing. We call the interaction between trade barriers and cybersecurity. There is a toy called My Friend Kaylee. I don't know the manufacturer of the toy, but the idea being, think of it like, it came out a couple of years ago, so think of it as kind of pre-Alexa, if you will, some Alexa, but you can talk to your doll, and your doll will talk back to you. It turns out Kaylee is connected to a server in Texas that processes the interaction and responds. The government of Germany banned Kaylee from being sold in Germany because it's saying there's no way to guarantee that the thing the server is hearing in Texas may not become disclosed. Doesn't mean they were disclosed, doesn't mean any privacy was violated, but there's no way to be guaranteed that could not happen. And that is the concern.
Stuart, thank you very much for all of this information. Thank you also to the audience who's stayed on. As Professor Madnick said, he has several courses that he does both online and in presence at MIT Sloan through executive education. Please do not hesitate to email myself or Jacqueline or Professor Madnick if you have more questions or interest. For those of you who are part of the Spanish-speaking audience, on Friday we will have a talk with Professor Roberto Rigoban and a research scientist from Harvard University, a former Minister of Planning from Costa Rica. But more than anything, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor Madnick. Stay safe, watch your cybersecurity, and please we look forward to you joining us in a future webinar or on campus when things start to calm down. So thank you again and have a good evening, good morning, or a good day.
One last thing I do want to say, I mentioned my email address. The website for CAMS is cams.mit.edu. You can learn a lot more about the research you do. Thank you all and have a great day, evening, or morning as the case may be.
Thank you. Good night.